All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I'm recording this in early April, but you will not hear this until sometime in the summer. And the goal of recording episodes like this is that, as you know, I'm in the middle of writing a book and I'm also a teacher. So I get 2 months off during the summertime. And for the summer of 2025, I really want to hammer down and get as much of that book done as possible. Just as an update, the book is divided into kind of two different parts. The first one is going to be a section on method, where I talk about capitalism and socialism and give a concrete definition of that, and then talk about political authoritarianism and the use of violence in political policy. And then I also outline my method for interpreting the Bible, and I also talk about the economic and political context of the Greco-Roman world, all as a foundation for interpreting the New Testament. And then in the second part of the book, it's going to be all biblical exegesis. And I'm going to have right now, I think, 4 chapters on the Gospels, 3 or 4 chapters on the Gospels, 3 or 4 chapters on Paul. I'll definitely have a chapter on James. I will definitely have a chapter on First Peter, and I'll definitely have a chapter on Revelation, and then maybe another one to kind of bring together all of the texts that are in the New Testament that are scattered in other places, and then probably one concluding chapter. So right now I'm almost done with the first part of the book, and I actually think that the interpretation is going to go pretty quickly. But what I wanted to do this summer is record a couple of episodes beforehand and then release them. That way I can spend as much time as I possibly can working on this book this summer. And I know in the past that when I've seen podcasters start to slow down their streams, or when the episodes seem to get shorter and shorter or less focused, that means that their podcast is almost done. And that's absolutely not what's happening here. So for those of you guys that enjoy the show, I know that this episode is probably going to be a lot shorter than a normal Tuesday episode, but I'm recording some of the stuff ahead of time. These are based on some ideas that I'm having that are really influencing my research. And I'm putting this out there to help me focus on getting this book written, so that hopefully, again, my goal is that by the spring of 2026, I'll have this thing done so that people can read it. That is my ultimate hope. This is going to give me an opportunity to do that. So I hope that you enjoy some of these short episodes. Probably not going to do a lot of Thursday bonus episodes during the summer too. Just keep it on the Tuesdays. And, once we get through this book, I'll be back to cranking out the big stuff with a lot of great authors. I am really excited about being able to do reading that's not related to the book again, but it's been really rewarding and refreshing writing this book. So that's enough of that. That is kind of the long version of the story that I wanted to share with you today, about why these episodes are going to be a little bit shorter and why there will be a couple of them. I'm sure I'm going to have some normal interviews and stuff like that during the summer, but I just wanted to have a few weeks where I didn't have to really worry about the podcast. I could just record everything ahead of time and go. So there's an issue that I wanted to talk about today, and this is the state of religion in America, and not just kind of religion in general, but Christianity in particular. And I read this article on Zero Hedge a couple of weeks ago that I thought was really interesting, just about the religious landscape of the United States. And I wanted to go through this article really quickly and give some of my thoughts on it, because I think it's very important. One of the, I guess, most important concepts that we have to grasp as American Christians is the problem with the category of religion. And I've talked about this a lot on the show, and it's going to factor in one of the chapters in my book pretty heavily, actually. But in the modern world, we have this kind of conception that religion is an idea that can be separated from somebody's social views or someone's political views. And there have been deliberate attempts to try to minimize the influence of religion on other aspects of life. But as many historians have noticed, most famously, or not, maybe actually not famously, unfortunately, but I guess most prominently, there's a book by a scholar named Brent Nongbre called Before Religion, which just explores how the Western world divided up the category of religion from politics and society and economics and all of those other areas of life. And the argument goes essentially that before the Enlightenment, people didn't really distinguish between religion and society and politics and economics. All of those things influence one another and were intrinsically intertwined. And so when we look at particular passages in the New Testament, this is the big payoff for us on this show. We can't think about the New Testament as a religious document, because it's not just that, in the sense that we as modern people think about religion as in terms of private spirituality. The Bible deals with all kinds of issues, and the values that Christians are obligated to follow aren't just what we would call like spiritual or theological values. They're values that in fact that impact every area of their life, whether it be in business or marriage or relationships or how they conceptualize, the Roman Empire or their local client kings or the procurators or whatever it might happen to be. And in the modern world, we really should be cautious when we use the term religion, because when we evoke that term, we oftentimes unintentionally assume that it's something that can be disconnected from the rest of life. And in reality, it's not. And we've seen this in modern American Christianity. People have kind of politicized their faith in a lot of ways that demonstrate that their commitments might not be purely theological, but that in fact, they might actually be taking their political beliefs and imposing them upon their Christian beliefs and creating this strange mixture of them. But for those of us that don't really believe that religion should be isolated from the rest of the way that we understand the world, this isn't that surprising. And this is one of the things for me when I was younger, as I was reading through the Bible for the first time, I realized that, like, if I was going to believe in Jesus, then this had to affect every area of my life. Like, God was going to hold me accountable for all of my decisions. And I couldn't say, well, I have my nice theological beliefs on the one hand, and I can separate that from like my political commitments or from the way that I treat people at work or from the way that I handle my relationships with my friends and family. Like, all of that has to be connected to the foundation, which is my Christian faith. So there's that problem with the term religion, but nevertheless, we have to use it because it is a term that is it is a term that's widely understood in the modern world. When someone uses the English term religion, we all pretty much know what that denotes. I want to make the point up front, though, that as I use this term religion, I realize that it's not something that can be disaffiliated from other areas of our life, and we have to be honest about that. All right, I'm going to try something that I've never tried before on the show, where I'm going to share my screen with you guys. So if you're watching this on YouTube, hopefully you can see this article here. If you're not, you just have to listen to me ramble on here. But let's see. I want to share this article so that you guys can see it. And all right, here we go. So I should have it there. And oh, yes, here we go. I can see where I have this article right now. So the article is from Zero Hedge. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and it's called Visualizing the Religious Landscape of the U.S. And the key takeaways of the article is that based on a recent study by Pew Research, which has been conducted several times, it shows the breakdown of religious affiliation in the United States. And generally, I've used some research from both Pew and Barna before. Both of them are research organizations that produce a lot of good work. So I would imagine that this is probably fairly accurate. So the key takeaways of the article are that the majority of U.S. adults would identify as Christian, 63%, with 23% being evangelical Protestants and 19% being Catholics, which are the largest group within this Christian majority. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans, 30%, are religiously unaffiliated, which makes sense. And despite its dominance, the share of Christians has decreased from 78% in 2007 to 63% in 2024, which in the course of about 20 years is quite a decrease. There's a really cool visual here if you're watching the show on YouTube. If not, if you're just listening to it, it shows these statistics. It says the religious landscape study was conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2007, 2014, and 2023 to 2024. The study visualized below surveys more than 35,000 Americans across all 50 states about their religious affiliation. And again, it shows that Christians make up about 63% of the population, whereas religiously unaffiliated, either nothing in particular, agnostic, or atheist, make up about 30%. And then Jewish is about 2%, with Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim all comprising about 1% of the population. So it goes on to say that Christianity in the U.S., after many years of steady decline, the share of Americans who identify as Christians shows signs of leveling off, at least temporarily. According to the study, the percentage of U.S. adults identifying as Christians declined from 78% in 2007 to 63% in 2023 to 2024. Since 2020, the percentage has remained relatively stable, fluctuating between 62% and 64%. The largest Christian subgroups in the United States are Protestants, who now make up 40% of U.S. adults, and Catholics at 19%. An additional 3% identify with other Christian groups, including the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. Both Protestants and Catholic numbers have declined significantly since 2007. However, the Protestant share of the population has remained relatively stable since 2019, while the Catholic share has stabilized since 2014. Meanwhile, the percentage of Americans identifying with a religion other than Christianity has been gradually increasing, though it remains in the single digits. Religiously unaffiliated adults, those who identify as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular when asked about their religion, account for 30% of the population. So there's some really interesting statistics here that I think are important to discuss. And I think that I kind of understand the reason why these numbers are the way that they are. First of all, when I read this, I had heard in a sermon, which is not always a great place to get information because you never know where the pastor's pulling it from. I had heard in a sermon that the percentage of religiously affiliated Christians in the United States was lower than 50%. But I think that actually had to do with the amount of Christians that went to church on a Sunday. And I think, and you can check me if I'm wrong, please email me or hit me up in the DMs on Twitter. I would love to see the actual statistics. But I believe about a year ago, there was a study conducted that said that something in the range of 35% of people that identified as Christians in the United States participated in a church of some kind on a regular basis. That means going to church or participating in church events twice a month, which is very low. So even though 60 something percent, 64, 65% of all US citizens would identify as Christians, only a very I guess not a very small, but only a percentage of those people actually attend church on a regular basis. So Christian is more of a cultural label for many Americans than it is something that they feel the need to practice. And I have to say that I think that those numbers are kind of disappointing, but they're also not very surprising. And I think that there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think I've shared this story on the show before, but it bears repeating. Maybe it was on somebody else's podcast. I don't know. But when I was in high school, I was in high school from 2003 to 2007. So my freshman year began in 2003. And my is that right? Yeah, it would have been right. 2003. Yeah. So my freshman year was in 2003, and I graduated in 2007. And during that time, I was involved in high school youth group, and we had a really good program at our church. We had some good people that were running it at that time, and we had, I would say like 20 kids regularly involved the majority of the time. And I had a handful of really close friends that I'm still close with now that were a part of that youth group. And then when I graduated and started working on my degree in biblical studies, I eventually took over the program at the church that I had been raised in and was there for 5 years. And then I wound up working in youth ministry for 3 years after that. And so from basically 2004 to 2016, when I stepped down from ministry, I was heavily involved in church culture and saw how this church culture worked from the inside. One of the really unfortunate consequences, and that's not a consequence, one of the really unfortunate, I guess, just realities of my experience in youth group is that of the 20 or so people that were regularly involved in our student ministries program, only 3 of us still go to church on a regular basis. Like only 3 of us are still plugged in. And a lot of people that were involved, maybe not a majority, but several of them have either rejected Christianity altogether or just stopped participating in the life of the church because it didn't hold any value to them. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And I used to be, when I was younger, I used to kind of be frustrated by that. Like, oh man, well, we all had the same experience and it was really, really good. But I realized that for a lot of my Christian friends in youth group, when I was in high school, they might have been involved in church and it was a very important part of their social aspect, but there was absolutely no discipleship coming from the home. And so I have a really kind of like funny, like one of my best friends who's just not involved at church in church at all anymore. I remember like her family was at church every single week, but and her parents were like very nice people, very, very good people. But I remember like her dad would always bring her and her siblings to church and then just kind of like sit out in the hallway while church was going on and talk to his friends, which I'd rather have someone be in the building. I think that's great. But you got to think about, as a parent, the kind of signal that sends to your kid when you're bringing them to church, but it doesn't seem like you care that much about what the church is actually teaching. And so I think that there were a lot of people that grew up in my and kind of my age range that had parents that told them that participating in church was important, but didn't ever really let it shape their lives in any meaningful way. The church to them was kind of like a country club. And again, I'd rather people be in church than not. I think that having your foot in the door is a huge first step. And if you have a good ministry team, you can really capitalize on that, build relationships with those people and help bring them in. But if there's no discipleship going on at the home, if church is just a country club, well, people can get those social bonds anywhere else. You don't have to go to church to have a community of people to be in relationship with and to do life with. And so when people went to college and realized that they could have friends that didn't go to church, then they just stopped going to church because it didn't seem very relevant for them. I also think that, and this is something I have talked about on the show a lot before, going back to the rise of the moral majority in the 1980s and the fact that the Reagan administration, quite brilliantly from an electoral strategic standpoint, realized that American evangelicalism, which even today, as we just saw in this article on Zero Hedge, makes up the large majority of American Christians. Ronald Reagan realized that this was a voting bloc that was more or less untapped. And even going back to the 1970s and the 1960s, it's hard for people to understand this now because we associate evangelicalism with conservatism. But before the 1980s, that wasn't the case. There was no natural political home for the evangelical community. And going back even further than that to the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century with the progressive era, a lot of evangelicals were actually progressive because they were premillennialists that believed that they needed to use the state to build a kingdom of God on earth before Jesus could return. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics. But what Ronald Reagan saw was that evangelicals didn't vote en bloc. And so if Ronald Reagan, and this is how he won in a landslide in 1980 and 1984, were one of the reasons why he did, was that he realized that if his campaign appealed to the evangelical voting bloc, that he could tap into that and swing a lot of states in his direction. And that's exactly what he did. And really, ever since the 1980s, the Republican Party has been identified with evangelicalism, which I thought was a really toxic deal all the way from the beginning, because this means that the wide, bold majority of the American church now identify with a particular political party, and the values of the Christian church were intertwined with the values of the Republican Party. And anyone who's listening to the show realizes that the Republican Party does not reflect Christian values in any meaningful way. All right, they're against abortion. That's awesome. Okay. But other than that, the Republican Party has never been the party of Christian values. But there were a lot of evangelicals that got swept up in that, and in fact are still swept up in that. And I remember, like, when I became a Christian in 2004. I had fortunately a mentor at church who was pushing me really hard to read the Bible. And so I was 14, hadn't really committed to my life to Christ yet, but I read the Gospels for the first time, and it was absolutely terrifying because it's insane. And then I had some other events happen in my life. And not long after that, I was like, I'm really going to dedicate my life to Jesus, and I'm going to start taking my faith seriously. And so I moved on to Acts, and then I moved on to the book of Romans. And I remember reading Romans one morning in school. We had like a silent reading block, and going through the first couple of chapters of Romans and just being like, oh my gosh, like no one ever told me that any of this stuff was here. And I feel like everything that I've been taught about Christianity up to this point just like is not what I'm seeing coming out of the Bible. And I realized like pretty much immediately after I became a Christian that like the Pledge of Allegiance in school started to feel uncomfortable to me. Like when we said the Pledge of Allegiance every day, I was like, well, I'm reading this Bible, and it kind of seems like I shouldn't be pledging allegiance to any country or anything like that. So I was kind of at an advantage because when I was in high school, I never really, like, I always thought that the association of my Christian faith with like American politics at all was pretty cheesy, like pretty not biblical. And the fact that I saw a lot of adults doing that, I didn't like despair of my faith and think, well, these guys are just hypocrites and Christianity is wrong. What I thought was, well, they're just not reading the Bible the right way. And if they read the Bible the right way, then maybe they wouldn't like have to have all these conservative beliefs, and they wouldn't think that maybe American Christianity can fit comfortably into one political party. But most of my friends did not have that experience. And so a lot of them were raised in kind of, quasi-conservative homes. And then when they went to college and realized it's just kind of like they could have friends with people that didn't go to church, they also realized that they could have political beliefs that were not a reflection of that kind of watered down conservative Christianity, then they wound up going in an opposite direction and rejecting the watered down conservative Christianity and embracing progressivism. And in fact, that's why I think that a lot of people that were raised in conservative youth culture are now openly progressive. I think that this explains the deconstruction and the ex-evangelical phenomenon that we're dealing with right now. But one of the things about like cultural Christianity in the early 2000s that I really wrestle with was just how much it tried to be relevant. Like, and this was a big part of youth group culture. It was like we wanted to, in youth group culture, pretend that we weren't assimilating to the predominant American culture while just creating Christian alternatives for every American cultural touch point. And so one of the lessons that I kind of learned, and I mean, there was even like, you think like there was like a magazine that might still be around, I don't know, called Relevant Magazine, that was all about like how to make our faith relevant in the modern world and how does our faith intersect with American culture. And even like in high school, and I was someone, I listened to like a lot of Christian music and I still do it. Like a lot of those like Christian hard rock and heavy metal bands, I still love them because they're great bands just in their own right. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the lyrics anymore. I think that they make good music, but it was like there was this concerted effort to try to get Christian teenagers to buy into Christian culture, and Christian culture was always related to conservative politics. And I think that that's a really big problem. And I was also kind of in this position, like when I'm in high school going through all this, where like I was struggling with, okay, my culture tells me that I need to be relevant, but like the Bible tells me that I need to pick up my cross and follow Jesus. And so like, which one is it? And I struggled with that for a really long time until I started studying it professionally in college. All of that is to say that like I understand why a lot of people have drifted towards the left, because there are many people that unfortunately grew up in evangelical churches that had compromised in some way with conservative Christianity, and they made the false assumption that Christianity was somehow embedded within American conservatism, or American conservatism was an extension of Christianity. And so when they rejected the conservative tradition, they wound up rejecting Christianity as well, because they had associated those two falsely, in my opinion. And so they embraced progressivism. Now, there are some people that assume that progressivism is kind of the political instantiation of Christian values, and I think that that's fundamentally flawed too. Like I've talked about that a lot on this show, and the book that I'm currently writing right now hopefully will drive a wrecking ball through the idea that Christians should ever be able to identify with progressivism or conservatism. That's my goal. I hope, but I really do understand why a lot of people left the faith. And we see this increasing number of Americans that are not religiously affiliated, the 30% that are either just they don't really think about Christianity very much, or they are openly agnostic or atheist. And I think that makes sense given our cultural context. Like I don't disparage people that take that mantle up, because it was never that much of a priority. And I see it even now in the church. A lot of people that I really love, they will come to church when there's not soccer practice, and they will come to church when they don't have something going on with school. Like church is something that's a priority, but it's not like the most ultimate priority. And they're willing to put church to the side when it comes to being involved in all these other activities, which, it's going to happen sometimes. Like I'm not here to judge anyone that has to miss church every now and then because they have another obligation. And I'm not even saying you have to go to a traditional church every Sunday to be a dedicated Christian or to be a part of the family of faith. But there are a lot of families that say that they make Christianity their priority, but then like they put other things in front of their faith, and like discipleship is almost a second thought. And I wonder what's going to happen to those kids in the future, because I saw what happened to the people that were in youth group with me that were raised in homes like that. A lot of them are probably in that 30% of Americans that are religiously unaffiliated, or that call themselves Christians, but it's nominal only. They're not, they don't practice Christianity in any meaningful way. And I just think that the generation that we're raising is probably going to continue along that trend, unless the church really focuses on discipleship and the gospel and being, honest about like what being a Christian entails, and of course trying to divorce our Christian faith from these very mainstream political currents that are trying to suck us in. And this is true of like, libertarians can easily fall under the sway of this as well. And you conflate Christianity with libertarianism, where it's almost like libertarianism is more important and Christianity becomes the justification for libertarianism. or I'm sorry, where libertarianism becomes the justification for Christianity. Whereas like my own perspective is that I was a Christian first, and a lot of the beliefs that I have as a libertarian, I had before I studied any political philosophy, and libertarianism just gives me the language to express in contemporary political categories the political consequences of my faith, which is the way that I would frame that. I'm a Christian who happens to be a libertarian. I'm not a libertarian Christian. The Christianity part comes first. And I don't think that the church is ever going to be able to recover any lost ground unless we realize that our ultimate allegiance has to be to Jesus and to Jesus alone, and that we're in the business of spreading the gospel and taking care of those who are in need and preaching the word and building this community, this kingdom community that just does things differently than the rest of the world. And until we're willing to embrace that responsibility that God has given us, then I don't think that we as a church are ever going to be able to make any real substantial inroads with the 30% of the American population. I also really worry too about the whole Trump phenomenon, because there are a lot of people that are riding the MAGA train right now that call themselves Christians, but that do not live by the standards of Christian values. And, you know, I have very traditional beliefs about sexuality, and I've lived those out consistently. Thank you very much. I know one of the few people that have, and again, no judgment to anyone listening to this podcast that hasn't done that. I understand life is very complicated, and we worship a gracious God, and so I appreciate his grace and mercy. But both my wife and I, when we were growing up, we were very, very serious about the notion that sex was for marriage, and we believe that modesty is important, and we were extremely consistent in that. Like we are the only people that we've ever been with, and you know, we're pretty modest in the way that we dress, and I know that we're fighting against a giant cultural tide. But it is funny how like many Christian or how many quote unquote MAGA influencers, especially the females. I'm not like body shaming or anything like that, but it's funny that just like you scroll on Twitter and you see all these female conservative influencers that have Bible verses in their bios, and they're posting pictures of themselves in bikinis on the beaches with suggestive sayings above them. And, you know, I just, as a Christian, I just think that's wrong. I just don't think that that's what we should be doing. And I think that that's a horrible example to the rest of the world. And if Christians don't have something to offer that's different than what everyone else is doing, then why would anyone ever take interest in our Christian faith? And it's the same thing too. Like I think about a lot of these male Christian influencers who, and I'm not necessarily against profanity. I think that like all language, words are just tools that help you communicate particular ideas, and profanities are tools that can be used in certain contexts to effectively communicate your ideas. So I'm not against profanity on principle. I think that there's a time and a place where profanity might actually be helpful to drive a point home or communicate a particular idea, especially if you're trying to explain the gravity of something to somebody. But I look at a lot of these conservative influencers and even like libertarian influencers that are males on social media that use pretty filthy language and talk about other people in extremely disparaging and humiliating ways. And yet they also have Bible verses in their profiles, and they call themselves Christians as well. And the thing about that is that like it sends a signal to the world that Christianity doesn't have to be any different. And that's the exact same signal that I think the evangelical church picked up on in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan convinced them to vote for him in the Reagan Revolution, simply because they were trying to appeal to a particular voting bloc that didn't have a home. And so we're going to lose, like Christianity in general is going to lose if we don't get serious about discipleship. Like if we don't start taking our faith seriously, we don't start taking the responsibility of spreading the kingdom and standing up to injustice and serving those that are in need. Like if we don't take that stuff seriously, then we have nothing to offer. And this is why like progressive Christianity is completely bankrupt. Like culturally, it'll be popular for a little while, but progressive Christianity, it will never survive because it only conforms to the prevailing cultural norms and will always be shifting wherever those cultural norms go. And so there's just nothing there. It's hollow, it's empty. You know, you can get whatever the progressive Christians are preaching, you can get that anywhere. You don't have to go to church to get it. And people are just going to wind up cutting out the middleman and getting it directly from secular communities. That's just the way that it's going to go. And honestly, that's a lot of what's happened on the Christian with the Christian right in the United States as well. People identify as Christian, but if your identification as a Christian means that you support conservative policies, but you can still post inappropriate pictures of yourself on social media and say really, really like horrible things to individuals on social media, then I just don't see how that I just don't see how people are going to find any value in that Christianity as well. So what do we do about this then? There's 30% of the population that does not believe in Christianity in any way. And then there's a large percent of the population that says that they're Christian, but don't actually engage in any discipleship. They don't actually do anything to promote or develop their faith. So what are we to do about that? And I think that this is where Christians like me and you, or maybe you're one of the listeners to the show that aren't a dedicated Christian and you're just like listening to this from the outside. I hope that you would agree with me and you would want the church to do better. I think that most people don't want Christians to be hypocrites, even if they're not Christian themselves. They're like, yeah, it's dumb when Christians say that they believe something and they don't actually follow it through. But I really do think that as a church, we need to get back to the fundamentals. I think that we need to get back to our message, like the gospel message that Jesus is Lord, that he died for our sins, that he was raised from the dead according to scripture, and that he currently sits at the right hand of God, ruling over all creation, and that we are his kingdom, and that the church and the church alone is called by God to build his kingdom on earth, that it's our responsibility and that we shouldn't abdicate that or give it over to anyone else. And this is exactly why I get so frustrated with both progressive and conservative Christians, because regardless of whether you're on the American left or right, one thing that they have in common is that they both operate with the assumption that we need the 19th century technocratic nation state in order to impose our theological values on other people in society. And we have to do that by violence. Of course, conservatives will sometimes acknowledge that these policies must be imposed by violence. Progressives never do. But as libertarians, we understand that like forcing somebody to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do and taking their money is a form of violence. And there's no way of getting around that. And there's no way of reading the New Testament that justifies that kind of violence against people that aren't like initiating violence against you. Like there's no way that the church can possibly consistently maintain its witness and continue to support either authoritarian conservatism or authoritarian progressivism. I don't believe that we can. And so as a church, we have to get back to the fundamentals and try to make the case to the wider society that Jesus is actually king. And beyond just saying that as a matter of theological doctrine, we have to actually live that out in practice, which the older I get, the more complicated I realize that becomes. When I was in my teens and early 20s, I thought that meant that you just had to be nice to everybody all the time and kind of brush, problems under the rug. And I realized that that's not the case now. And I know I say this all the time, but I'm a seventh grade. I teach seventh grade social studies in a public school, and so we have kids that come from a lot of tough backgrounds. And one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years is that like the most loving thing that you can do for people like that is be really, really tough on them and like hold them to really high standards. And there sometimes I'm just like vicious in what I do and say at school, but it's all designed to like help these people grow. And as a Christian, that's been one area that I've really had to kind of stretch and think creatively over the last couple of years. Like, well, how do I approach human beings in a way that actually helps develop them as individuals so that they can reach their God-given potential? And how do I do that in a way that is consistent with my faith? These are very difficult questions. And I'm sure everyone listening to this show can think of people that are in their life that desperately need the gospel, but that are like hard to deal with. And I can't tell you exactly how to creatively deal with those people, but I do think that we need to start having better conversations about how we can reach the wider world and actually make an impact without just assuming that we're going to pass some law or support some politician and all of this is going to be fixed for us. I mean, the reality is Joe Biden isn't going to save you. And when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Andy Beshear wind up running for president for the Democrats in 2028, and it's JD Vance and Marco Rubio or whoever, they're not going to rescue you either. Like there's not a way out of this situation that's political. The only way that we're ever going to be able to change the culture in the United States, both in terms of like Christianity and like downstream from Christianity, trying to build a more peaceful, loving, compassionate society that doesn't rely on the use of force against innocent people, is by witnessing to the gospel. And I think that when we do that, we would start to see the numbers that are in the Zero Hedge article tilting back in our favor. Maybe we're never going to get back above 65% of American Christians identifying, or of American citizens identifying as Christians, but maybe we can get beyond the 35% of that group practicing their faith on a regular basis. And when we do that, then we can really change the world. I believe that we can. So I thought that was a really interesting article, and I wanted to share that with you guys today. Again, this is a shorter episode, 35 minutes. It looks like it's going to be by the time I'm done talking. So I hope that you enjoy the shorter episode. It's summertime. I'm hoping that I know, most of you guys have to work. I could spend all day writing a book and doing podcasts and things like that, which is pretty cool part of my job. But I really do hope that you guys appreciate this episode and that it helps you think about our responsibility as Christians and the reasons why we're in this position right now. This is definitely a topic that I've covered on the show before. I mean, I think I've done maybe 2 episodes related to this way back in the day, a couple of years ago. It's hard to believe I've been doing this for this long. Honestly, if you have any thoughts on this, I would love to hear them. Reach out to me on Twitter, email me, whatever you got to do, and we'll talk about this more. It's an important conversation, and we're going to keep on having it. And again, I'm hoping that in 6 or 7 months, I'll have this book out and you guys can read it and and at least like understand where I'm coming from. I really do think it's important to get these ideas out there in the real world. Until I'm done with this book, hit me up on Twitter at Pro Liberty Pod. Follow me on YouTube. I'm trying to build that. That is at Pro Liberty Pod on YouTube as well. 1,000 subscribers, I've heard, is the magic number to really get your content pushed out there. And right now, this is in April, obviously, but right now I'm at like just over 250. So I could use some help there. So if you can send some people my way for YouTube or Twitter, that'd be awesome. As always, go to libertarianchristians.com, buy our merch. You can get yourself a highball glass. I know that it's summertime. It's going to be a lot of bourbon on the rocks this summer, and that's always a good little treat to enjoy on a hot summer afternoon. So get yourself a highball glass, and you too can have some bourbon on the rocks with me. Or if you don't drink, which I respect that, you can have some tea or some whatever, iced coffee. There are all kinds of things you can drink out of that. You got a mug over there, all kinds of Protestant Libertarian podcast merch, and hopefully by the time this comes out, there will be more of it. Well, as always, thank you guys so much for listening to the show today, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a good one.